In the last 4 years, Italy has been setting up yet another ticking debt time bomb for itself that is currently set to cost the Italian state over 200 billion euros. Oxford Economics said it was the worst tax policy implemented in all of Italy in the last decade. When I discovered this, it felt so mismanaged I almost couldn't believe it. Italy's economy minister compared it to a nuclear power plant that continues to emit radioactivity. How could this have happened? How could a country like Italy, that is so scrutinized by international media and other European countries for having the second highest debt to GDP ratio in the EU, not do enough to reduce it? It's called the super bonus, and it was introduced by the Italian government during the pandemic. It allowed homeowners to renovate their houses to make them more energy efficient. Insulation, heat pumps, double glazed windows, new boilers, etc. They could then claim 110% of the money that they spent on the project back in the form of tax credits. Basically a deduction on their taxes, meaning effectively they would make a 10% profit on the whole thing. Here's a quote from the Reuters article. With such generous handouts, homeowners had no reason to haggle with builders over costs. On the contrary, as payments exceeded what they would spend, higher costs meant more money was left for the homeowners. It's 110% of the cost of the project, so you get 10% on top of the cost of the project. So there's very little incentive to keep the costs of the project low. It's all paid for. There was also another tax bonus that allowed building owners to redo the front facades of buildings and then claim 90% of those costs back in tax credits as well. When the bonuses were introduced, it was expected to cost the state 35 billion euros over 15 years. Modest, reasonable, responsible. Currently, the super bonus alone has cost over 160 billion euros, and the total cost of all the schemes put together is now 219 billion euros. That's according to the current Italian finance minister, Giancarlo Giorgetti. So for each year from 2024 to 2026, it's going to cost 40 billion euros. In August, Prime Minister Meloni said that 12 billion euros in irregular building contracts related to the schemes had been found, and she called it, quote, the biggest scam the state has ever suffered. The schemes did spur a massive increase in construction output in Italy, which spiked 31% over the last 4 years. It helped contribute to Italy's strong growth since the pandemic that has mostly outpaced similar-sized European economies. But obviously, it didn't come for free. It's coming at a cost to the Italian taxpayer. Yeah, the problem is that a significant portion of that growth was in relatively unproductive construction businesses, which are going to contract as soon as the scheme ends. The situation as recently as 6 to 12 months ago was oh, Italy's doing pretty well. They've had stronger than average growth since the pandemic, better than France, Germany, and the UK, and things are looking up. But something foreigners often missed when analyzing the Italian debt situation is the fact that much of the debt from the bonuses has not yet been recorded. The impact only happens when the individual Italian consumers claim the tax credits to pay the building companies, which only happens when the renovation work is completed. So there's actually a backlog of tax credits. So Italy is currently projecting a slightly optimistic decrease in their debt, but people are now starting to revise that because they're thinking about this a bit more, and they're like, ooh, maybe it's actually going to increase because the tax credits will be higher than they expected in 2025 and 2026. But Italians themselves also didn't anticipate it. So the government would have to bankrupt tons of households and tons of construction businesses if they wanted to repeal it, basically. Literally all Italian political parties across the spectrum have supported these bonuses at one point or another. It was introduced by the Conte government, and then the Draghi government didn't do anything to stop it. And initially the current right-wing government didn't support the initial measure, but they actually recently voted to expand and extend it later on. No one wants to be the one to pull the rug from people. Including the technocratic government of former European Central Bank leader Mario Draghi, who guided the Eurozone through the European debt crisis. It feels really unlikely that it was just some kind of whoopsie screw-up of epic proportions. Apart from boosting the Italian economy during the pandemic, I can see some really obvious benefits to these bonuses. Well, if you look at the data, Italian property values dropped by about a fifth from 2011 until 2015, to which they stagnated for years, up until the first quarter of the pandemic, when they've started to rise by almost 10% until now. So Italian homes have increased like over 5% since the years of the pandemic, and before the pandemic, prices were falling, kind of in free fall. I mean, you've heard of these like Italian villages that are dying, and like the old people are moving out and no one is moving in. So yeah, so Italian homeowners, of which 73% of Italians have seen the values of their homes increase by 5% in the last, or more than 5% in the last like 4 years or so. On top of the cost for the state that the super bonus is causing, it's also transferring wealth to homeowners and to people who had their facades renovated, basically, and their energy efficiency standards increase. More energy efficient, prettier buildings are going to be worth more. Yeah, they were talking about how Mrs. Maria is like the Italian equivalent of, it's like Mr. Joe average, but like it's a woman, Mrs. Maria. Mrs. Maria didn't have to upfront any cash for the energy renovations, and now she's going to be saving money on it, on both her taxes and on her energy efficiency savings, and on the value of her home being more valuable now because it's more renovated. It's basically a wealth transfer from the state coffers into these people, homeowners, who decided to take up the deal, of which a lot did, as we've seen. Signora Maria now has a house that's more valuable, has a house that is more energy efficient and will save money in the wintertime, is more beautiful and pleasant to live in because those airy walls were replaced by nice new ones, and the facade is now beautiful and painted instead of crumbling and decrepit, like a lot of Italy is. Tons of Italian cities suffer from depopulation and just like deteriorating infrastructure of the building stock. More than half of all Italian homes were built before the 1970s. And the first energy standards were introduced in the 1970s. So, I mean, you can imagine like grandmas are freezing their little tushies off. Quote, of Italy's more than 31 million dwellings, 15% were built before 1918, and a further 65% were built before the first energy-saving laws were passed in 1976. At the time of writing this video, Italy has the most expensive electricity in the EU. And houses use 40% of all Italian energy. Waste heat loss is an economic inefficiency. It's literally lighting money on fire. The super bonus isn't just environmental or cosmetic, it's literally a money saver. Homeowners will now be saving a lot more money after the works are completed. These issues are also compounded by the fact that Italy was a major importer of Russian gas, now cut off due to the war in Ukraine, and it will continue to suffer from high energy prices for the foreseeable future. A lot of countries these days suffer from high real estate prices, but Italy has often suffered from the opposite problem. Declining cities and towns that are depopulating, housing stock that is aging and declining in quality, and the problem of wealth storage. If an Italian invested in the real estate market in 2011, then they would have less money now than if they had literally done nothing with that cash at all. And it's way worse than if they had invested in growing assets, like stocks or bonds or something. Tax credits in 5 years are going to be worth less than money today due to inflation. Or in other words, if you do 100,000 euros of work now, that's 100,000 euros that goes straight into the economy. The construction company pays salaries and purchases materials, and the banks finance the movements, and people get their energy efficient house. Let's say inflation is 2% per year. The future value of the tax credits is 100,000 euros over 5 years, with an inflation rate of 2%. So 100,000 euros in tax credits received over 5 years would be worth about 90,000 in today's money if inflation is 2% per year. That's way more attractive for the Italian state. Since you're getting 110% with the super bonus, then the present value of the same tax credits would be slightly under 100,000 euros for 100,000 euros of work. It's like 99,642. If the economy continues to grow during these years, then that also helps state finances. So the Italian economy has grown in recent years, more so than Germany, more so than France, and money has been invested in fixed assets that have improved, that have increased in value. So it's a bold idea by the Italian state to basically transfer state money into people's assets, especially homeowners' assets, but it's not so clear-cut as just like, oh, the Italians have messed up their deficit again and they're going into debt again. Oh no, you know?